When truth is buried, the silence is demanded. We stand at our freedom's edge.
And this is our Freedom's Edge. Welcome to our Freedom's Edge, episode 12. What are we becoming? There are moments in a country's life when the question is no longer only what is happening. The deeper question becomes, what is happening to us? Not just to our laws, not just to our politics, not just to our institutions, but to our conscience, to our standards, to the line inside us that used to say, no, this is not who we are. Because countries do not only change when laws are passed, they change when people begin accepting what they once would have rejected. They change when humiliation becomes entertainment, when lies become background noise, when decency starts to look weak and contempt starts to look bold. When people say, this is just how things are now, as if getting used to something excuses what it is doing to us. This episode, What Are We Becoming?, is a question I want us to sit with today. Not as an accusation thrown only at someone else, but as a mirror. What are we becoming when the things that used to shock us barely interrupt our day? What are we becoming when contempt is mistaken for strength? What are we becoming when people lower their standards just enough to stay comfortable? And what are we becoming when we begin confusing survival with surrender? These aren't just hypothetical questions. Because the truth is, we don't change overnight. This shift happens so quietly, you almost don't feel it. One of the most dangerous things that can happen to a person or to a country is that we begin getting used to what should still disturb us. Not suddenly, not all at once. Usually it happens slowly, a little at a time. A lie that once would have caused outrage becomes just another talking point. A threat that once would have alarmed people becomes just another headline. A public act of meanness becomes something people scroll past while drinking their coffee. And every time that happens, something shifts. I felt this in a conversation with my neighbor shortly after we began the war with Iran. I mentioned to him the number of service members who have been killed. And his response was, well, it's only been 7, right? Only 7. I remember snapping back, only 7? Because what does that even mean? Only 7 families shattered? Only 7 empty chairs? Only 7 people who put on the uniform and did not come home? And that is when the question hit me even harder. What are we becoming when human loss becomes a number small enough to dismiss? That is not strength. That is nothing but moral numbness. And moral numbness is one of the clearest signs that something in us is being changed. Because when the unacceptable becomes familiar, our conscience has to work harder to stay alive. That is how moral erosion works. It comes dressed as exhaustion, as practicality, as I can't deal with this today, as well, both sides, as that's just politics. And little by little, we adjust. We adjust to the noise. We adjust to the contempt. We adjust to the lies until one day we look around and we realize we are living in a place we barely recognize. And one of the first things we become accustomed to is contempt. Not always loud contempt, not always obvious contempt, but the kind that learns how to disguise itself. Contempt doesn't always arrive looking like contempt. Sometimes it arrives as a joke, as sarcasm, as entertainment, as just asking questions. But contempt is still contempt, even when it learns to speak politely. And one of the most dangerous signs is what people begin laughing at. Because when a society starts laughing at the pain of vulnerable people, something has gone seriously wrong. When people mock the disabled, immigrants, transgender people, women, Black and brown communities, veterans, the elderly, or the grieving, we should not only ask, who said that? We should ask, why did so many people enjoy it? Because one hateful voice is one thing, but a crowd trained to enjoy humiliation is something else. That is how the moral atmosphere changes. People begin defending behavior they once would have condemned. They begin saying, well, I don't like everything he says, but, and that but becomes a doorway. I don't agree with racism, but I don't agree with the threats, but I don't agree with the humiliation, but at some point, that but is not a moral boundary. It's a permission slip. Because if cruelty is not a deal breaker, then we have to ask what is. If lies are not a deal breaker, then we have to ask what is. If public humiliation is not a deal breaker, then we have to ask what exactly we believe decency means. But most people do not think of themselves as cruel or indifferent. Most people tell themselves a story that makes compromise easier to live with. And those stories matter. Most people don't wake up in the morning and decide to become less compassionate. They tell themselves stories. Stories that make compromise feel reasonable. Stories that make silence feel wise. Stories that make fear feel practical. We tell ourselves, it's not that bad. Nothing I say will matter. I don't want to lose friends. I'm just tired. And some of that is human. People get tired. But there is a difference between needing rest and building a home inside denial. There is a difference between protecting your peace and protecting your comfort from the truth. Because the stories we tell ourselves eventually shape the people we become. If I keep telling myself harm is not my problem, I become someone who can live beside harm. If I keep telling myself lies are just opinions, I become someone who no longer honors truth. If I keep telling myself silence is neutrality, I become someone whose silence helps the powerful. I know this because I lived it. I am gay. For most of my life, I've lived in a quiet middle ground, not fully hidden, but not fully open either. When the queer comments were made, I looked away. When the jokes were told, I stayed quiet. When people said, "You just need a good man to fix you," I let it pass because challenging it felt exhausting. I watched younger generations gain freedoms I never had growing up, yet I still carried that old societal whisper: keep it quiet, keep it private. Do not make people uncomfortable. For a long time, I told myself that silence was simply the price of peace. But eventually, the question in this episode caught up to me. What was my silence teaching the next generation? Who had I become by giving society exactly what it wanted? My invisibility. And I realized something painful. I did not like the smaller version of myself I had created just to feel safe. So I stopped hiding the line. I stopped editing myself for the comfort of other people. I started speaking openly about my life, my relationships, and who I am without lowering my voice or checking the room first. And when I did, something unexpected happened. My openness became safety for someone else. A younger gay person in my community, terrified of being seen, told me that seeing me speak openly helped them feel less alone. That mattered to me more than I can explain. And that is part of why I am speaking these words into this microphone right now. Because I cannot ask other people to live courageously while hiding myself behind silence. I cannot talk about conscience while abandoning my own. So, this is me stepping fully into the light of my own life. Not because it's easy, not because I suddenly stopped being afraid, but because I no longer want to participate in my own erasure. And because the next generation deserves to inherit a world where they do not have to apologize for who they are. That is why this question, what are we becoming, matters. What are we becoming as we excuse, defend, ignore, and normalize? because we are not untouched by what we tolerate. What we excuse shapes us. What we defend reveals us. And what we ignore does not disappear. It grows. Which is why eventually we have to come back to the line inside ourselves. Because before a country loses its direction, people often move their own lines first, quietly, gradually, one excuse at a time. Every person has a line inside of them, a line that says no, a line that says that is too far. That line is conscience. And conscience is not just a feeling, it is a responsibility. But conscience can be trained. Every time we listen to it, it becomes clearer. Every time we betray it, it becomes easier to betray again. The first time hurts. The second time bothers us less. By the fourth time, we may not even call it compromise anymore. We may call it being realistic. We may call it maturity. But sometimes what we call maturity is just fear that learned a much better vocabulary. Sometimes what we call balance is just unwillingness to name harm. And sometimes what we call not getting political is really a refusal to protect the people politics is hurting. There are moments when we have to ask ourselves, where is my line? And has it moved? Did I move it because I learned something deeper? Or because keeping it where it was would have cost me something? And that question is very uncomfortable. But it's supposed to be, because conscience is not meant to keep us comfortable. Conscience is meant to keep us honest. But when we ignore conscience long enough, something else begins to happen. The abnormal starts feeling ordinary, and the unacceptable starts feeling expected. That is where normalization begins. Normalization is not simply accepting something, it is learning to stop reacting to it. That is what makes it dangerous. The first time you hear something hateful, it may shock you. The 100th time, you may just feel tired. And exhaustion can become a doorway to acceptance if we're not careful. Because when we're tired enough, we may begin mistaking numbness for wisdom. We may begin saying, maybe this is just how people are. Maybe this is just politics. Maybe nothing can be done. But numbness is not wisdom. It is often the spirit trying to survive too much ugliness for too long. Now, I understand that. It's hard to stay awake in a time when so much is designed to exhaust us. But we have to be careful, because the people who benefit from harm are not only counting on agreement, they're counting on exhaustion. They don't need everyone to cheer. They just need enough people to stop objecting. That's why rest matters. We are human beings, not machines, and no one can stay emotionally outraged every second of every day. But there is a difference between resting and retreating from our conscience. Normal is not the same as moral. Common is not the same as acceptable. Legal is not the same as just. Popular is not the same as right. But if we leave the conversation there, it stays too easy. It stays outside us. And this question was never meant to stay outside us because eventually we have to ask, what am I becoming? It's so very easy to make this question about other people. What are they becoming? But the deeper question is, what am I becoming? Millions of people voted for this current administration after seeing exactly what was being offered. They saw the contempt. They saw the attacks on vulnerable people. They saw the lies. They saw veterans and fallen service members used as symbols while sacrifice itself was disrespected. And still, for many of them, none of that was a deal breaker. Some say it was about the economy. Some say it was about gas prices. Some said, I don't like everything he says, but. And that's where but matters. Because when hatred is not a deal breaker, that tells us something. When threats against democracy are not a deal breaker, that tells us something. When human dignity is negotiable, that tells us something. And what it tells us is not only about politics, it tells us what people are willing to accept. This is not about perfection. None of us are perfect. There will be moments of fear, fatigue, confusion, and avoidance. But there's a difference between being imperfect and being indifferent. There's a difference between being tired and being morally asleep. The question is not whether we have ever failed. The question is whether we are still willing to be honest. Honest about what we are seeing, honest about what we are tolerating, honest about what is changing in us. Because honesty may be where we begin again. The honesty of saying, no, this is not normal. No, this is not acceptable. No, this is not who I want to become. No, I will not let contempt train me to be contemptuous. No, I will not let lies train me to stop caring about the truth. No, I will not let fear decide the size of my conscience. But refusal is only the beginning. At some point, we also have to ask what we are choosing instead. Not only what we refuse to become, but who we still want to be. Maybe the question, what are we becoming, has another question underneath it. Who do we still want to be? Because becoming is not only something that happens to us, it's also something we participate in. Every day in small ways, we are becoming someone a little more compassionate, or a little more hardened, a little more courageous, or a little more careful, a little more awake, or a little more willing to sleep through someone else's suffering. We do not control everything. We do not control our politicians. We do not control every lie. But we do have some say over who we become in response. And that matters because history is not only shaped by the loudest people, it is also shaped by the quiet decisions of ordinary people. The decision to excuse or not excuse, the decision to repeat the lie or refuse it, the decision to laugh or not laugh, the decision to protect comfort or protect conscience. That is where episode 13 will go next. Because if episode 12 asks, what are we becoming? Episode 13 asks, how did we get here? And part of that answer is this: we kept moving the line a little further, a little quieter, a little more often, until the thing we once rejected started looking normal. But before we go there, we have to sit honestly with the question underneath all of this: what are we becoming? And are we willing to notice before we forget who we are? I do not ask these questions with hopelessness. I ask them because I still believe questions can stir something in us, not as a political label, not as an insult, but in the oldest human sense, to come back to ourselves, to remember what matters, to recognize danger before it finishes shaping us. But if we can still ask, what are we becoming? Then maybe we're not finished. If we can still feel disturbed by human suffering, then maybe our conscience has not gone quiet. If we can still grieve what is being normalized, then maybe something in us is still alive. And if something in us is still alive, then we still have a choice. Not an easy choice, not a comfortable choice, but a real one. We can keep adjusting. We can keep explaining. We can keep lowering the line. Or we can stop long enough to say, this is changing us. And I do not want to become someone who can live easily with this. I do not want to become someone who shrugs at humiliation. I do not want to become someone who mistakes power for goodness. I do not want to become someone who forgets what decency costs. So let the question stay with us. Let it bother us. Let it follow us into our conversations, our choices, our silences, and our excuses. This episode does not end with a challenge in the usual sense. It ends with a reflection. What are we becoming? What are we learning to tolerate? What are we explaining away? And who do we still want to be before we forget who we are. This is Freedom's Edge, where courage meets conscience. Stay awake, stay vigilant, stay loud, stay free, and stay on the edge with me.
When truth is buried, the silence is demanded. We stand at our freedom's edge.